In the summer of 1972, an old man in a hospital bed in a forgotten town in Eastern Europe asked the nurse to bring him a pencil and a piece of paper. He was 91 years old. His hands were thin as paper themselves. The nurses had been told he was a retired engineer. They had been told he was harmless. They had not been told that he was the last man alive who had walked out of a room in 1939 and refused to sign his name to a document that, according to him, changed the way every human being on earth would think, feel, sleep and dream for the rest of time. He wrote for 19 minutes. He folded the paper. He gave it to a young priest who had come to sit with him. He died before sunrise. The paper was hidden for 47 years. And when it finally surfaced in a private archive in 1999, it contained a sentence that has haunted researchers ever since. He wrote, "They did not change the frequency to help us hear better. They changed it so that we would stop remembering." If you have ever felt that something about this world is slightly off, that the buildings are too grand for the people who supposedly built them, that the old photographs show a civilization we cannot quite explain, please do me one small favor before we go further. Tap the subscribe button. Tap the like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be told. Thank you, friend. Now let us return to the old man and to the room in 1939 and to the question that no historian wants to answer. His name, as best as we can reconstruct it, was Alexander Volkov. The records are deliberately incomplete. He was born in 1881 in a province that no longer exists, in an empire that no longer exists, under a flag that has been erased from almost every history book printed after 1945. By the age of 30, he was one of a small handful of engineers in the world who specialized in something that today we would call architectural acoustics, but which in his time was called by a different word, a word that has been quietly removed from modern dictionaries. He called it the science of the singing stone. To understand what happened in that room in 1939, you have to understand what Alexander Volkov believed about the world he had inherited. He believed that the great buildings of the previous century, the cathedrals, the opera houses, the grand railway stations, the exposition halls, were not simply buildings. He believed they were instruments. He believed they had been tuned. He believed that every dome, every vault, every long marble corridor had been designed to vibrate at a specific natural frequency, and that this frequency, when a human voice or a human orchestra met it, produced a sensation in the listener that we have no modern word for. The closest word, he said, was remembrance. The buildings made you remember things you had never personally lived. He believed this was not mysticism. He believed it was simple physics, applied by people who knew more than we do. In the world that Volkov grew up in, the tuning of an instrument was not a settled matter. Across Europe, across America, across the empires of the East, musicians and engineers had been arguing for nearly 100 years about a single number. That number was the pitch of the note called A, the note that every orchestra in the world uses to tune itself before a performance begins. In Vienna, the standard was one value, in Paris another, in St. Petersburg a third. Every city, every old building had its own preferred number, and the number was not arbitrary. The number was chosen in each case to match the resonant frequency of the rooms in which the music was performed. The buildings, Volkov insisted, came first. The tuning followed. There was, however, one number that kept appearing in the older records. It sat in a particular place on the scale, and the old acousticians described it in language that sounds strange to modern ears. They said this pitch was the pitch at which a healthy human body standing still in a properly built room would feel a faint warmth at the base of the spine and a quiet pressure behind the eyes. They said it was the pitch at which a singer could hold a note longer without fatigue. They said it was the pitch at which the dust on a marble floor would arrange itself into faint patterns if the note was held long enough. The number in the units we use today was 432 cycles per second, 432 hertz. Volkov did not invent this number, he inherited it. It was the working standard of every major opera house, every major cathedral choir, and every major imperial orchestra in continental Europe from roughly 1850 to 1910. There are records. There are tuning forks in museums marked with the number dating from this period. There are conservatory documents specifying this pitch as the standard. There are letters between composers complaining when a performance hall used a different pitch, because they could feel, they said, that the music had lost something. The buildings, in Volkov's words, knew their own voice, and the voice was 432. By the time Volkov was a young man, pitches were drifting upward. The reasons given were practical. A higher pitch made stringed instruments sound brighter. A higher pitch carried farther in larger halls. A higher pitch suited the louder style of music that was becoming popular as the old empires began to crack. Volkov objected on architectural grounds. He pointed out that the cathedrals had been designed with their domes and their long naves tuned to specific frequencies that lay close to 432. He pointed out that if you tuned a choir even slightly higher, the dome would not resonate. The stone would not sing back. The sensation, the warmth, the pressure, the dust patterns would not appear. The room would still be beautiful, but it would have gone quiet in a way that only a few people would be able to detect. This, Volkov believed, was the beginning of the forgetting. Not a dramatic event, just a slow drift until one day the buildings and the music no longer matched. He believed that the old civilization, whatever we want to call it, had built the world to vibrate, and he believed that someone somewhere did not want that vibration to continue. In the spring of 1939, an invitation arrived at Volkov's small office. It was printed on heavy paper, embossed with a seal he did not recognize. It came from an international standards body in London, a body that had been quietly assembling for the previous 2 years. The invitation asked him to attend a closed conference in the month of May on the subject of the standardization of musical pitch. He would be one of approximately 30 delegates. He would represent the acoustics tradition of the old empire, the tradition that he was almost the last man alive to fully understand. He accepted. He travelled by train across borders that would not exist 6 months later and arrived in London in the first week of May. The conference was held in a building near the river. Volkov, in his later notes, described it with unease. It was, he wrote, a relatively new building, constructed in the 1890s in a style that pretended to be much older. The main meeting room was panelled in dark wood. There were no windows. The acoustics of the room were terrible. It was a room in which no sound could resonate. It was a room in which voices died as soon as they left the speaker's lips. He wondered on the first day why a conference on musical pitch had been scheduled in a room that was acoustically dead. By the third day he understood. The room had been chosen precisely because nothing in it could vibrate. The decisions made in this room would not be felt. They would only be heard. There were, by his count, 29 other delegates, 2 from the French tradition, 4 from the German, 3 from Italy, 3 from Britain, 2 from the United States, and a scattering of others. There were also, he noted, 4 delegates whose national affiliations were not clearly stated, and whose names did not appear on any conservatory roster he had ever seen. These 4 men sat together at one end of the long table. They did not introduce themselves at the opening session. They did not speak during the first 2 days. On the third day, when the actual vote was called, they spoke for almost an hour, and after they spoke, the outcome was no longer in doubt. 3 candidate frequencies had been listed for discussion. The first was 432 cycles per second, the traditional pitch of the old cathedrals and the old opera houses. The second was 435. The third was 440, a pitch growing in popularity in broadcasting, where higher pitches were said to transmit more cleanly across long distances. Volkov had come prepared to argue for the first. He had brought documents. He had brought tuning forks. He had brought photographs of cathedral interiors with the resonant frequencies of their domes calculated by hand. He had spent 6 months preparing. He believed naively that the conference was a genuine inquiry. By the morning of the third day, he understood that the conference was not an inquiry. It was a confirmation. The decision had been made long before any of the delegates had received their invitations. The 4 unnamed men spoke in turn. The first spoke of the practical needs of broadcasting, of the economic value of a unified pitch. The second spoke of the scientific advantages of a higher pitch. The third spoke of the political situation in Europe, of the urgent need for cultural unification, of the dangers of allowing every old empire to cling to its own local standards. During his speech, several of the delegates glanced uneasily at the door. The 4th man spoke for almost half an hour. He did not speak of music, he did not speak of buildings, he spoke of the human nervous system, he spoke of recent research, conducted, he said, in private laboratories, on the effects of sustained exposure to different acoustic frequencies on what he called the higher functions of the mind. He spoke of memory, he spoke of suggestibility, he spoke of the ability of a population to be governed. Volkov listened. He took no notes. He understood by the end of the 4th man's speech that the new pitch had not been chosen for radio. It had not been chosen for orchestras. It had been chosen because it produced a particular effect on the human animal, and the effect was the effect of forgetting. The old pitch made people remember. The new pitch would make them comfortable, alert, productive, and easily directed. The old pitch resonated with stone. The new pitch resonated with the new materials of the new century, with concrete, with steel, with glass, with the cheap plaster of the buildings that were already replacing the cathedrals. The new pitch was a pitch for a new kind of city, for a new kind of mind. The vote was called at 3 o'clock. Each delegate was asked to stand and say a single word, yes or no. The delegates from France stood and said yes. The delegates from Germany stood and said yes. The delegates from Britain stood and said yes. The delegates from Italy hesitated, looked at one another, and said yes. Around the long table, one after another, the word was repeated, yes, yes, yes. When Volkov's turn came, he did not stand. He remained seated. He looked at the chairman, a small man with very pale eyes, and he said in careful English, "I cannot agree to this. I cannot place my name on a document that will silence the singing of the stones. I am not refusing because of music. I am refusing because of memory. If we change this number, we will lose something that cannot be recovered. We will lose the sound of who we were." There was a long silence. The chairman did not respond. He simply nodded to the secretary, who marked Volkov's name with a small cross in the margin of the official record. The vote continued. The remaining delegates stood, one by one, and said yes. Volkov was the only delegate to vote no. By the morning of the 5th day, he was on a train heading east. 4 months later, the war began. The borders that Volkov had crossed on his way to London ceased to exist. The empire that had sent him as a delegate was dismembered within weeks. His small office was confiscated. His papers were seized. His tuning forks, the heavy brass ones marked with the old pitch, were melted down. The conservatory, where he had taught for 20 years, was renamed, then closed, then reopened under a new administration that taught only the new standard. The old buildings were still there in many cases. The cathedral still stood. But the choirs that sang in them now sang at the new pitch. The domes did not resonate. The stones did not sing back. And by the end of the war, almost no one alive could remember what the difference had felt like. Volkov survived by a combination of luck and obscurity. He spent 2 years in a mountain village working as a clockmaker under a false name. He spent 3 years in a labour camp where he was assigned to repair the loudspeaker system that played propaganda music every morning and every evening. The loudspeaker system was tuned to the new pitch. Every prisoner, every day, was bathed in the new frequency. He observed that the prisoners who had been in the camp the longest had a particular look in their eyes. He described it as a look of unbroken alertness, of constant low-level wakefulness, of an inability to settle into the deeper kinds of stillness that human beings required in order to remain fully human. They were not exhausted. They were not broken. They were, he wrote later, unable to dream. When the war ended, Volkov was 54. He returned to the city of his birth, which had changed its name twice during his absence. He found that his house had been demolished, that his sister had died. He was offered a teaching position at the new State Institute, on the condition that he sign a document accepting the new standards. He refused. He spent the next 20 years working as a piano tuner in private homes in old churches that were no longer used for worship. He tuned, whenever the owner permitted it, to the old pitch. He was the last working tuner in his entire country who still maintained the old standard. He kept a single brass tuning fork, the only one he had been able to hide during the war, in a small wooden box that he carried everywhere he went. By the early 1970s, Volkov was in his 90s. He lived alone, in a single room above a bakery. He walked every afternoon to a small park where the remains of an old bandstand still stood. The bandstand had a small wooden dome. Volkov, in his last years, would sometimes stand under the dome and softly sing a single note. He would hold the note for as long as his old lungs allowed. He would listen for the response of the wood. He would tell anyone who asked that the dome still remembered, even if no one else did. In the spring of 1972, Volkov fell ill. He was admitted to the small hospital in the town. On the evening of the 16th of June, he asked a nurse to send for a priest. The priest who came was a young man, not yet 30. He sat with Volkov for nearly 4 hours. Then, around midnight, Volkov asked the nurse to bring him a pencil and a piece of paper. He wrote for 19 minutes. The priest did not look at what was being written. When Volkov finished, he folded the paper in 3. He handed it to the priest. He said in a voice the priest later described as very calm and very tired, "Please keep this. Please do not read it for at least 20 years. Please give it, when the time comes, to someone who will understand what it means." The priest took the paper. He put it inside the cover of the small prayer book he carried with him. Volkov died shortly before sunrise on the 17th of June. The priest kept his promise. He carried the prayer book with him for the next 27 years, through 3 different parishes, through 1 period of imprisonment, through his eventual retirement to a monastery in the mountains. He did not read the paper. In the autumn of 1999, the priest, by then 70 years old and suffering from a heart condition, decided that the time had come. He travelled to the city. He met with a private archivist who specialised in the recovery of documents from the lost cultural heritage of the old empire. The archivist understood the moment he saw the paper what he was holding. He had it photographed, transcribed, and translated within a week. The original was placed in a sealed environment in a small private archive that does not appear on any public registry. The paper was short. It contained no more than perhaps 400 words, but every sentence carried weight. Volkov began by addressing whoever might one day read the document. He wrote, "I do not know your name. I do not know the year in which you are reading this. I do not know whether the world you live in still has buildings that can sing. I hope that it does. I am writing this because the men who made the decision in London in May of 1939 are now all dead, and there is no one else left to tell you what really happened. I was the only delegate who refused to sign. I was not braver than the others. I was simply older, and I had no family left, and the men with the pale eyes could not threaten me with anything I had not already lost." Then he wrote the central passage. He wrote, "The frequency was not changed for music. The frequency was changed because there was, in the buildings of the previous century, a record. The record was not written. The record was not spoken. The record was held in stone, in dome, in vault, in the precise mathematical proportions of rooms that had been built by people who knew how to make stone remember. When a choir sang in such a room, at the proper pitch, the room would respond, and the people inside the room would feel for a moment the presence of the civilization that had built it. They would feel its breath. They would feel its weight. They would feel that they were the inheritors of something vast, something coherent, something that had been deliberately constructed by minds far greater than our own. The new pitch broke this. The new pitch was off by just enough. The rooms still functioned as rooms. The music still sounded like music. But the response was gone. The remembering was gone. And within 1 generation, the people who walked through those rooms would no longer feel that they had inherited anything at all. They would feel that the rooms had always been strange, slightly oversized, slightly ornate. They would feel that the buildings did not quite belong to them. They would be correct. He continued. He wrote, I do not know who built the old buildings. I do not believe the official histories. I have studied the cathedrals of my own country, and I can tell you, as an engineer, that they could not have been built by the populations that the histories describe. The proportions are too perfect. The acoustic design is too sophisticated. The materials, in many cases, are not local. The records of construction are too thin. There was a civilization before ours, friend. I do not know what to call it. In my country, in the old village tales, it was called by a name that the modern dictionaries have removed. Some have called it Tartaria, some have called it the Old World, some have called it simply the time before. I do not know its true name. I know only that it ended, and that the ending was not natural, and that part of the way it was ended, perhaps the most important part, was by changing the frequency at which its buildings could speak. In the final passages, Volkov turned away from accusation and toward instruction. He wrote, "I do not write this so that you will hate the men who did this. They are dead. Hatred will not undo what they did. I write this so that you will know. Knowing is the beginning. The buildings are still there. Many of them. The old cathedrals, the old opera houses, the old railway stations with their iron and glass domes, the old exposition halls, the old palaces, the old observatories, they are still standing in your time in cities all over the world. They have been retuned, they have been silenced, they have been surrounded by new buildings that drown them out, but they have not been destroyed. The stone remembers, friend. The stone is very patient. If a choir were to gather in one of these old rooms and to sing at the old pitch, 432 cycles per second, the room would respond, the dust would arrange itself, the warmth would return, the weight of the old civilization would press faintly against the inside of your chest, and you would know, for the duration of a single held note, what your ancestors knew. And then, in the final lines, he wrote the sentence that has become, for many who have read it, the line they cannot forget. He wrote, "They did not change the frequency to help us hear better. They changed it so that we would stop remembering. Do not let the remembering die with me. Find the old pitch, find the old rooms, stand under the old domes and sing. The civilization that built them is not gone. It is only sleeping. And it will wake when enough voices remember the right note." He signed the letter with his full name. He dated it in his old careful handwriting, the 16th of June, 1972. He folded it. He gave it to the priest. He died before sunrise. That, friend, is the story of the last delegate who refused to ratify the 1939 frequency change. It is, I will admit honestly, a story that mainstream historians do not accept. The standard account of the May 1939 conference describes it as a routine technical meeting focused narrowly on the practical needs of broadcasting and international musical performance. The standard account does not mention 4 unnamed men. The standard account does not mention a vote in which a single delegate refused to sign. The standard account does not mention Alexander Volkov. There are no easily accessible photographs of the conference. There is no published transcript. What we have in place of those records are the recollections of a few old engineers, the testimony of a priest in a mountain monastery, the careful work of a small handful of private archivists, and one folded piece of paper. You will have to decide, as you always must, what you choose to believe. But before you decide, let me tell you about the buildings. Consider the great exposition halls of the 1870s and 1880s. They were built, according to the standard histories, as temporary structures to house the world's fairs that travelled from city to city. They were enormous. They were intricate. They were filled with statues, fountains, indoor gardens, electric lighting, at a scale the surrounding cities had not yet achieved. They were built, we are told, in months. They were dismantled almost as quickly. The photographs that survive show buildings the size of small cities, with domes the height of cathedrals, with interior columns of polished stone, with glass roofs covering acres. The records of their construction are remarkably thin. The names of the workers who built them are largely unrecorded. And then, when the fair ended, they were taken down. Photographs of the demolitions are rare. The remains, if any, were cleared. The sites were turned into parks, and the cities moved on, as if nothing the size of a small mountain had ever stood there. Volkov, in his unpublished papers, argued that these exposition halls were not built for the fairs at all. He argued that they were buildings of the previous civilization, briefly exhibited and then demolished or hidden during the Great Transitional Period. He pointed to their acoustic properties. He pointed to their precise mathematical proportions. He believed that the world's fairs of that period were, in part, an elaborate cover, a way of presenting the old buildings to the public as new wonders, and then quietly removing them before too many questions could be asked. He made similar arguments about the cathedrals, whose construction periods are often listed as having stretched across 2 or 3 centuries, and whose records frequently contain gaps of 50 or 60 years during which, supposedly, no work was done. He argued that the gaps were not pauses in construction. They were the moments at which the buildings were quietly absorbed into the narrative of the newer civilization, having been built much earlier by people whose names have not survived. I am not asking you to accept all of these arguments without question. I'm telling you what Volkov believed and what the small network of researchers who recovered his letter has come to believe. The buildings exist, the proportions exist, the acoustic anomalies exist, the thin construction records exist, the strange exposition photographs exist. You can investigate them yourself, you can stand inside the old buildings, you can listen for the silence where there should be resonance, you can hold up a tuning fork if you wish, and you can wonder why the old pitch and the old rooms seem to have been made for each other, and why the new pitch and the new rooms seem to have been made to forget. This is the story of one old man, in one quiet hospital, in one forgotten town, who refused 87 years ago to put his name on a document that he believed would silence the singing of the stones. It is the story of a frequency, and of a choice, and of a civilization that, according to him, was not so much destroyed as quietly muffled, the way you might place a heavy cloth over a bell so that it can no longer be heard ringing in the dark. Whether you choose to believe him, or to dismiss him, or to set the question aside for another night, I leave entirely to you. I have only told you what he wrote. I have only told you what the priest carried. I have only told you about the buildings that you can, even now, walk into and touch with your own hands. The stones are still there, friend. They are old, and they are patient, and they are waiting. And somewhere, in a sealed archive in Eastern Europe, there is a folded piece of paper written in the trembling hand of a 91-year-old engineer that ends with a single instruction. Find the old pitch, find the old rooms, stand under the old domes and sing. The civilization that built them is not gone. It is only sleeping.